Alright, welcome everyone to my dynamic joints tutorial. I'll be walking you through creating a setup just like this. And this is a FK chain and a dynamic chain. And I'll walk you through what that means throughout the process. But this is the effect we're looking for, creating one joint chain that's driving this dynamic joint chain. And then creating a control that lets you manipulate some of the attributes of that dynamic chain. So you can alter the property and tweak whatever results you want from that. Alright, so you'll notice here I made two joint chains. They're all oriented the same way. They have the exact same number of joints. This FK joint chain is the one that's going to be driving your dynamic joint chain, and you won't need that right now, so let me hide that. And your dynamic joint chain, to start off with, you're going to want to create an IK spline handle. What you really want out of this is just the curve. So we can delete the IK handle right here. Let's call this curve the original curve. And you can see we have this nice curve that's generated right in the middle of our joints. So because of the way the IK spline handle works and the curve it generates, you can do this tutorial on any joint chain in any orientation. If it's curved or whatever, it doesn't have to be a straight line. You can still get the dynamic properties no matter what. So once you have your curve, you're going to go into the upper left-hand tab, into your Effects tab, and into Nhair, where you're going to want to make your selected curves dynamic. And of course, make sure you have your curve selected. Click on that, and you'll have these 4 tabs that are generated. And you can see it generates a follicle, a hair system, a nucleus, and I'll go into what those mean too. But here is your original curve, and that's the one that's not going to be simulated. And here's your dynamic curve, so let's call that dyne curve. Name all your stuff, it just helps with organization so much down the line. So once you have your dynamic curve generated, your hair system, your nucleus, like that's all the stuff that goes into creating a simulation. Let me just play this and show you what effect it has. So yeah, as you can see, the dynamic curve is kind of bouncing like that. But we don't really want that kind of effect. We want it like loose at the end. We don't want it attached at both points. So to fix that, we're going to go into our follicle here that's containing our original curve, into the attribute editor, and right under here, under follicle attributes, you're going to go into point lock and click base. Both ends is what's giving us this attachment at both ends of the joint chain. So clicking base will then unhook this end and let it fall nice and neat, just like that. But as you can see, our joints are not moving with it, so we're going to create an IK spline handle, but instead of creating our curve, we're going to use this dynamic curve that's already been created. So let's uncheck Auto Create Curve, click first joint, last joint, and then Dynamic Curve. And now you'll be able to see this is now driving our dynamic joint chain, just how we wanted. This original curve now is just hanging out doing nothing, but it's pretty important because there's an attribute called Start Curve Attract on the hair system. And if you're curious, you can go into the channel box and see it right here, and that's down to 0. That determines exactly how closely the dynamic joint chain follows the original curve. So now that if it's 0, you can see there's no attraction whatsoever. But if I bring that up to, say, 0.3, it's much more stiff and it follows that shape a lot better. But to drive it, we're going to need another joint chain. So we've got the FK chain here, and we're going to highlight all of these, select the original curve, and then go back into our rigging tab, go to skin, bind skin, and just make sure it's on closest distance. Just make sure it's not on heat map or geodesic voxel, because that only works on geometry, not curves. So closest distance, this all should work fine. Go to bind skin, and now you'll see that the FK chain is now driving that dynamic joint chain, which is pretty cool. So if I want to set a key right here, let's key that. And then that. Let's see it in action. It did not key. There we go. Okay. In action. There we are. Woo! It works. Okay. So naturally, of course, you're not going to want to key your joints like that. So I'm just going to quickly use a tool I've made, which will create some controls for me. So I've got that. I'm going to color those blue, because why not? Oh yeah, and now I've got controls for my FK chain that I can now key and move, and those will be driving my dynamic chain however I want it to. This can be hooked up into any rig, you know, it follows this hierarchy. So you can attach it like any other FK chain. But there's still one more issue, that start curve attract that I mentioned earlier. That you don't want to have to go in every time you need to change it, go through all these attributes and, you know, look around, find out where that's at. So you're going to want to create a control to drive that, to just have easy access for you, for the animators. So let's just go in and create a circle, or a diamond in my case. And then let's add a few attributes. Now, when you're making attributes, I'm setting these up as direct connections, so it's going to be directly controlling every attribute that I put in. So if your minimum is 0 and your maximum is, say, 1, which is what I'm going to do for the start curve attract, just make sure you're selecting your control when you're making the new attributes, or else it'll just go on whatever you have selected. My minimum is going to be 0, so that's when, you know, there's no start curve attract whatsoever, and my maximum is going to be 1. But I think I'm going to put the default at 0.1, just so whenever it's generated, whenever the simulation is played, that's not something you have to tweak to get it to at least follow along somewhat with the joint chain. So let me add that. And I'm going to add another attribute called motion drag, which is, if you're doing any underwater creatures, this can be super useful. Drag and motion drag especially, because that sort of smooths out the curve and makes it slower, makes the follow through a little more gentle. And that can give you some really great follow through effects with like a fishtail, or like if you have, you know, anything flowy underwater. I think I did it with seaweed one time. But yeah. Whenever you're putting in these values, the minimum and maximum, you're going to want to double check in the hair system. And this is just because you'll see that there's a built-in minimum and maximum right here. So motion drag is just 0 and 1 like usual. Start curve retract is just 0 and 1 like usual. But you'll see in here, like with turbulence, which is also another fun thing to add if you just want wind motion, turbulence frequency and speed start out at 0.2. These are between 0 and 2, but their default value is 0.2. So you're going to want to make sure to get their minimum as 0, their maximum as 2, and the default is 0.2. So that's just important going forward, so you know exactly what to what you're doing with the control, and you know you're keeping the default values the way they are, while still letting them be keyable by the animators. For stuff like motion drag, I'm going to keep the default on 0, just because that's something that affects how something moves through the world. So I've got these two attributes now. They're not connected to anything. They don't do anything. Let's call this sim control. Let's make it yellow. So we're going to want to go into the node editor. I've got the sim control right here, and that has our new two attributes on it. Don't need the shape. Get rid of that. And you're going to bring your hair system in. You can click on that in the outliner, middle mouse drag it in, and you're going to want the shape. It's got all those attributes on it. So for motion drag, just directly hook it up right there. And that's what I mean by a direct connection. It's directly driving. The value you put in here is going to be controlling the value that shows up here. And then start curve retract is going to go right in here. And that's that. So whenever you play it, you've got, it's simulating at 0.1, start to curve attract. Let's key this a little bit. So yeah, you can see it's pretty loose because of that 0.1, but now we can go in and change that manually. So let's drag that up to 1, and then you'll see it's much stiffer. And then if you want to change motion drag, bump that up a little bit. It'll smooth it out and like dampen the settle. So it's just a much smoother action overall. And if you have like any sine waves incorporated into your characters, it can give you some really awesome follow through. But yeah, that is the conclusion of the dynamic joints tutorial. If you want, like I mentioned before, you can make this so it's set up like a IK-FK arm. You can create a switch to switch between pure FK and pure dynamic. But overall, this is something that if you want to incorporate into a rig, I find it pretty useful. I've incorporated it into a lot of my rigs. I think it's like almost all but one characters on my demo reel. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to post underneath this video or send a message to any of the officers. Have a good day.